some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
This hour, because there's been a development in the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie.
There are some puzzling new developments tonight in the ongoing search for Nancy Guthrie.
By the time investigators hit their first real turning point, they weren't focused on the ransom anymore. Not the amount, not even the wording. What shifted the entire direction of the case was where the messages were sent. Because while everyone assumed this was about money, the reality was something far less predictable and far more deliberate. Within days, 2 new communications surfaced, but they didn't go to the FBI. They didn't go to a tip line. They were sent directly to a media outlet. And that detail mattered more than anything else, because people trying to negotiate don't usually broadcast, and people trying to stay hidden don't invite attention. That's not negotiation. That's exposure. So why would someone risk being seen unless being seen was the goal? To understand that, you have to go back to the beginning, before the messages, before the theories, just the facts. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in a quiet Tucson neighborhood. Her routine was consistent, almost predictable. The night before she disappeared, she had dinner with family. She was driven home. She went inside. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her. The next morning, she missed a scheduled call. That was unusual. When family members went to check on her, nothing looked disturbed. No broken entry, no signs of a struggle. But something was wrong. Her phone was still there. Her medication untouched. The kind of
Because when someone doesn't break in, they enter, which leaves only a few possibilities. They were let in, they had a key, or they knew how to access the home without resistance. Access changes everything. It transforms the case from a random event into a controlled one, because access isn't accidental. It implies familiarity, not just with the location, but with the person, the routines, the environment, the timing. And once investigators begin working from that premise, the questions change again. They stop asking who could have done it. They start asking who could have done it without resistance. That's where behavioral analysis becomes more important than surface-level facts. Because when something significant happens, people rarely stay exactly the same afterward, even when they try to. Investigators began looking at deviation from baseline. Not dramatic behavior, not obvious panic. Subtle shifts, changes in communication patterns, frequency of contact, tone, availability, presence in expected places. Friends recalled normal routines. Family described consistent habits. So when those patterns changed, even slightly, it stood out. Not publicly, not conclusively, but enough to require closer attention. Because consistency is expected. Inconsistency is not. At the same time, physical evidence outside the home began to take on new meaning. Around 2:28 a.m., the same moment tied to the pacemaker disconnect, a vehicle was captured on a camera roughly 2.5 miles away from NY's home. That distance matters. It sits just beyond the immediate neighborhood, just outside the area where early searches tend to focus. Not too far, but far enough to suggest movement away from a controlled environment. And in cases like this, movement away from structured areas usually points to one thing: concealment. It doesn't prove intent, but it aligns with it, especially when timing matches a fixed window, especially when it connects back to a disappearance with no visible struggle. Then there was another detail, one that might seem small at first, but carried significant weight once placed into context. NY's phone. It was left behind. Not dropped, not lost, left. And that decision changes how investigators interpret everything else, because a phone is more than a device. It's a tracker, a communicator, a record of movement, contact, behavior. Removing it from the situation or choosing not to take it, suggests awareness. Awareness of how investigations work. Awareness of how devices are used to reconstruct events, which leads to a deeper implication. This wasn't just someone acting in the moment. This was someone thinking ahead, someone reducing variables, someone controlling what could and couldn't be traced. And when you begin layering all of these elements together, the timeline, the access, the behavioral shifts, the movement, the decision to leave the phone behind, a pattern begins to form. Not chaos, control. This was not random. This was controlled. What shocked you more, the timeline or the access? Because once access is confirmed, the list gets very small. At a certain point in an investigation, the pieces stop feeling separate. They don't just exist side by side anymore. They begin to align. And when that happens, the case shifts again. Not outward, but inward. By now, investigators weren't working with isolated clues. They were working with structure. The timeline had already been fixed. The digital layer was producing anomalies. Behavioral patterns were beginning to shift. And access, quietly, had already narrowed the field. Individually, each of these elements raised questions. But together, they started pointing in the same direction. And when independent clues point to the same place, what does that mean? It means the investigation is no longer exploring possibilities. It's building probability. One of the key concepts investigators begin to consider at this stage isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like what people expect from movies. It's quieter than that. Repeated presence. Because in structured events, the critical moment is rarely the first time someone enters a space. It's usually the last. And the last entry only works because there were others before it. Unnoticed, unremarkable, but consistent patterns of movement. Devices appearing in the same area more than once. Routes that don't match normal behavior. These are not coincidences. They're measurable. This is what reconnaissance actually looks like in real cases. Not surveillance scenes, not cinematic buildup. Just repetition. Quiet familiarity built over time. And that matters, because once a location is visited more than once, it stops being incidental. It becomes intentional. At the same time, forensic work continued, largely out of public view. DNA analysis, especially in environments where multiple people have been present, is rarely straightforward. Mixed samples require separation, isolation, verification. It takes time, not because nothing is happening, but because precision matters. In some cases, when direct matches don't exist, investigators turn to genetic genealogy. Not a fast process, but a powerful one. It doesn't look for a single identity immediately. It builds outward. Family connections, distant relatives, shared markers, until eventually a path narrows back to one person. Again, not instant discovery, structured reconstruction. Parallel to that, video analysis expanded. Not dramatic footage, not clear images, just fragments. A vehicle passing through one frame, another camera picking up direction, a third confirming timing. Each piece small, individually insignificant, but together, directional. Because when you know the window, you know what to look for. And the path that began forming from those fragments wasn't random. It wasn't circling back toward the house. It was extending outward, away from structured areas, away from visibility, toward places where movement becomes harder to track. And the path wasn't leading inward, it was leading away. That distinction matters more than it seems, because inward movement suggests intrusion. Outward movement suggests removal. And removal in a controlled environment reinforces everything that had already been building. The timeline, the access, the behavioral shifts, the digital anomalies, all of it was beginning to converge. At this stage, the case no longer looks wide. It looks quiet. But that quiet isn't a lack of progress. It's a sign of focus. Because when investigators begin narrowing internally, they stop speaking broadly. They stop speculating. They begin confirming. Silence is not absence.
The structure is forming, and the gap between what happened and what can be proven is slowly closing. This case isn't over. It's narrowing. The truth didn't disappear. It just hasn't been spoken yet. If you believe Nancy deserves answers, leave a comment for her. Early February, Tucson, Arizona. By the time investigators hit their first real turning point, they weren't focused on the ransom anymore. Not the amount, not even the wording. What shifted the entire direction of the case was where the messages were sent. Because while everyone assumed this was about money, the reality was something far less predictable and far more deliberate. Within days, 2 new communications surfaced, but they didn't go to the FBI. They didn't go to a tip line. They were sent directly to a media outlet. And that detail mattered more than anything else. Because people trying to negotiate don't usually broadcast, and people trying to stay hidden don't invite attention. That's not negotiation. That's exposure. So why would someone risk being seen unless being seen was the goal? To understand that, you have to go back to the beginning. Before the messages, before the theories, just the facts. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in a quiet Tucson neighborhood. Her routine was consistent, almost predictable. The night before she disappeared, she had dinner with family. She was driven home. She went inside. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her. The next morning, she missed a scheduled call. That was unusual. When family members went to check on her, nothing looked disturbed. No broken entry, no signs of a struggle. But something was wrong. Her phone was still there, her medication untouched, the kind of things she would never leave behind. Nothing was broken, nothing was stolen. So what actually happened inside that house? Do you think this was planned, or something that went wrong? Nancy Guthrie's life, by all visible accounts, followed a pattern that rarely changed. She lived in a quiet residential pocket of Tucson, the kind of neighborhood where movement is minimal and routines become almost invisible over time. Neighbors came and went on predictable schedules.